Welcome back to another episode of Extra Literary Affairs. As part of our Stream of Consciousness September series, Joey and I will be having an affair with Juan Jose Saer and his short story, Half Erased. Last week, we explored the encounter by Iranian author Goli Teragi, and this week we are discussing Half Erased from a celebrated Argentinian writer, Juan Jose Saer, from his 1976 collection entitled The One Before. And Joey, before we share our summaries of Half Erased, I just wanted to give a tiny bit of context about this author because I had never heard of him before. Usually, when we talk about Argentinian writers, we say, Borges, this is the writer that we know. This author has been compared to Borges, but wrote a little bit later. And unfortunately for Saer, he is not as internationally well known as Borges. So I was really glad that you brought this story to us. Could you tell us, how did you come upon this author? What is the reason we're talking about this today?
I mean, most of these authors that you're like, I've never heard of them. I've never heard of them either. I just research authors in different parts of the world. And obviously, he was in Argentina. And I saw him compared to Borges. And I was like, somebody is compared to my boy Borges. I gotta read him. And for whatever reason, I read Half Erased first. It was like one of the longer short stories at the end of that collection. And I immediately read it. I was like, we gotta talk about this. This is too good.
Awesome, Joey. I appreciate that. I would like to break our tradition and give a short initial impression of reading Half Erased. I literally read it in a day. I had to sit with it. I had a very strong emotional and sentimental and nostalgic reaction to the story, which I was not expecting to have that experience. And I told you, I think I need to take a break and sit with this and try to talk about the story on another day. That was very shocking to me that there were so many personal elements in this story, which technically should have nothing to do with my lived experience at all.
Yeah, that's what I'm wondering what you're talking about.
And it really was shocking to me how deeply affected I was by the story, Joey. And we'll get into the reasons for that later. What I would like to do is give us a short summary that was compiled from someone else before we share our own interpretations of what we think this story was actually about. Half Erased by Juan Jose Saer is a quietly unsettling meditation on memory, identity, and the fragility of perception. That is a very succinct representation of what the story is about. And we often say, if you were explaining this to someone who's never read the story before, what happens in this story? And I think a lot happens and nothing happens. There are so many reflections upon reflections that if we're plotting it on a sheet of paper, what happens? He goes and sees this flooded area. He talks to his friends. He blows off his goodbye party, and then he's gone. Well, that doesn't really sound like a great story. Why would that cause anyone to sit and reflect for 2 days on the nature of experience? And Joey, that brief introduction for me is not in any way adequate to the experience of reading the story. And before I say anything else, I just wanted to also mention this was originally written in Spanish. Again, we are speaking about a work that neither one of us have experienced in the native language, so we are relying on the translator. And I would love to read just a little translation note from the translator that I thought perfectly encapsulated the problem that I am having with this work. So the translator said, soon after completing the translation that you are about to read, I was invited to speak at a conference on Saer in Buenos Aires. The panel was titled, rather provocatively, Is it possible to translate Juan Jose Saer? I will leave this question for the reader to judge. And this translator goes on to state, the task is to create a narrative that is authentic to memory itself. It's a circular narrative in which the position of the narrator would be like that of a boy who, riding a horse on a merry-go-round, tries at each pass to snatch a steel loop from the ring. When I read that, I thought, exactly. It feels like this story is getting repeated and it's in a circle, and I don't know what time is happening. Is this a recollection? Is this being recounted in real time? It was very fluid. And because this is Stream of Consciousness September, I think it nailed it on all of the criteria that we talk about when we talk about what is stream of consciousness in a narrative. Joey, I'm going to turn it over to you. Initial impressions, your summary, or why the stream of consciousness is so effective.
He introduced us to this author, Juan Jose Saer. As I said, I was researching different authors and he popped up, and then I saw Borges and I was like, good enough for me, I'm going to read it. What I really fell in love with was the language. You just mentioned it's a translation from Spanish into English, is what we read. So it's really interesting that I found the language to be so beautiful. Not that that's not impossible. Of course it can happen. And this is a great example of that. But the prose itself is so beautiful and so evocative. There are so many lines that I had to literally stop myself reading and just be like, what does this even mean? Not in a bad way, but I will compare him to Borges in this, in that Borges often said, especially if you read The Craft of Verse, and I'm paraphrasing, okay, obviously, he said it much more eloquently than I'm about to, but he basically was saying in poetry, and I will compare this in poetic language, you don't necessarily have to understand every single word or every single line or phrase or sentence or paragraph. You just need to feel in the moment. Something has to be evoked in you, and you don't necessarily have to assign language to it. You just have to understand that this made me feel something. And so that happened for me in this story. I highlighted the line when I first read it that made me go like, oh my God, I haven't even finished. I'm nowhere near the end of this story, and I'm gonna have to discuss this with Jennifer. So the line is, I will have to deal with the unfamiliar thought that a city where I was born and where I have lived nearly 30 years will continue living without me. And then I say that a city is an abstraction we concede to, so we can give a particular name to a series of places that are fragmentary, unconnected, lifeless, and that most often exist in imaginary time, bereft of us. That's exactly what happened. I was like, what does that even mean? But I had to stop and be like, that was so beautifully rendered. I don't know what he's exactly getting at when I first read it, but I was like, this made me stop in my tracks and say like, oh my goodness, this is excellent writing. This is elevated here. And I really loved it. And I was like, nope, that was it. Hook, line, and sinker. And I was like, I got to read everything this man's ever written.
Joey, I love that passage. And I think we've had this conversation before. I remember reading a phrase very similar, but some of the words were different when they were talking about what is a city. And in the version that I recall, it talked about a city being a contextual construct. It's an imaginary thing that we all agree on. And I really appreciated the way that in the version that you read, which I think may be different than the version I've read, that it evoked that sense of what is real, what is not real. There are so many echoes in this particular story. And when I was preparing to discuss this with you, because, oh my gosh, Joey, there is so much in this story, I was thinking about the repetition, about the craft of writing, about identity, about who is seen and not seen. And Joey, I know that you are a twin. And in this particular story, there is a set of identical twins who were fascinating to me from the standpoint that they played games with the people around them, including their sexual partners, by pretending to be the other person. And there was one individual in the story who was not having it. She was like, I know exactly who each of you are, and I can't stand the other one. One is my lover, and one is the other, and I know the difference, and I will not be fooled. That was just such an interesting plot device to put these characters in this story. It made me think very much about the ethical nature of tricking people. But that for me also, Joey, is the question of identity. I think we're all tricking each other all the time by the faces that we make, by the clothes that we wear, by the way we present ourselves one day. One person knows me in one context, somebody knows me in a different. And I just thought he did a really great job of exposing himself for this writing, but also it's called Half Erased, which is not a coincidence. He talks about his own dissolution of self. He's like, wait, am I myself? Am I my brother? I see a photograph. I'm not sure which one of us is which. And does it matter if we're different? I think that's part of what threw me for a loop and made me have to sit with the story, thinking about the nature of identity and truth and representing yourself to yourself accurately.
He's maybe not going through an identity crisis. I think he firmly understands that he is not his brother. But there is this sort of phenomena that happens. As you said, I am a twin, not identical, a fraternal twin, but still I look like my brother and he looks like me, where you get accustomed to answering to the other person's name when someone mistaken you. So I will answer to the name Dylan. If I'm walking down the street and someone screams Dylan, I'm going to turn around just out of habit, knowing it's not my name. It's an interesting take that I think happens, especially because you're talking about they switched out for their sexual partner, even though it was also done on the other end. The women were also, I believe, switching out
They
to try and keep
said
up.
they did that. I think that in my translation, the Wilder brother, who is not the narrator, who is the other brother, said in his mind, he justified it because he believed that she also had a twin sister and they were doing that. But it was not a confirmed thing. So for me, it felt like a very convenient excuse for the brothers to share this particular woman. For me, that was a hard concept to have because in the culture that I grew up in, that is very much a taboo for people to engage with their siblings' lover. That just doesn't seem to be a thing that happens in my worldview.
I mean, I think the thing that grossed me out was that they were tricking her into having sex with a stranger. That's non-consensual sex. That was definitely like, ooh, I wish this wasn't in here. I don't know that it really served a purpose other than to help explain the relationship between cat and pigeon.
Joey, what I thought was also unexpected in this story, but it shouldn't have been unexpected to me, was the sexualized elements. There were some graphic sexual things that happened that were just like, okay, I guess we're going there. That's fine. I told you that I had a very strong reaction to this story. I am not Argentinian. I do have friends that are from Argentina who have lived through this experience. And I was longing for an experience I had never had, but I had my friend and his family recount this experience to me, and that is why it was so effective. In Argentina, apparently, all the time, for any reason, you get a big chunk of meat, you fire up the barbecue, you invite 20 people over, everybody's drinking bottles of wine, you stay up all night, you're telling stories, you're drinking, you're dancing, you're listening to the music. It sounds like the best party in the world. And this is like a Tuesday night. They just do this all the time. And he recounts that in this story that he goes to one of these barbecues and he sees his friends, and just all of that imprinting for me felt like a recollection of something that I longed for that I never experienced. And when I mentioned that to my friend who had lived through that experience, he's like, everyday Argentinian people who have experienced this are not going to think that that was extraordinary in any way. That was not out of the norm. One of the things we do here on Extra Literary Affairs is that we try to open up our worldview. We try to get some empathy or try to say, what would it be like to be in this culture? The characters, I wrote down a list as we often talked. Who gets introduced? When do they get introduced? Who is named? Do you really trust the names that they're giving? I'm fairly certain that the mother in this story, who remains unnamed but is called Mother, and she does not seem to be a stellar human being from my experience. She doesn't seem overly mothering from my viewpoint. I'm sure the brother's name is not Cat, and I'm sure the other brother's name is not Pigeon, but those are their pet names. The fact that I had to write down on a sheet of paper, and you'll see my little cheat sheet here, the characters, who their spouses were, but who they were actually sleeping with, did not correspond. There was a lot of extramarital stuff going on, which felt in this story totally not an issue. It is not an issue. It just happens and things just progress. And I think that also was interesting for me to think about when we're talking about identity and self-representation. And as you said, consent. All of these people, other than the woman who was tricked, it felt like, go where the spirit moves you. If you would like to engage in a romantic and sexual relationship with someone, feel free. Nobody's going to tell you that that's not a thing that's open to you.
Yeah, it's interesting that there's sort of this sexual promiscuity, and that Cat, at least in my translation, is said to be the plague a few times. That's repeated. So I didn't really pay close attention to the sexual aspect of it. I mean, obviously I know it was in there because I read it, but it's not something that I would typically pay that close attention to in literature. It doesn't really do anything for me. It's interesting that stuck out to you. He is then compared to the plague multiple times. I think Elisa is the one who calls him that. I couldn't really figure out why would she be calling him the plague. So it's possible that maybe he's spreading a disease.
I did find that to be an interesting word choice. And one of the things that I wanted to know about the story, it was written, they believe, and first published in Spanish in 1976. What was going on in Argentina in the mid 70s until 1983? And once I received that context, it brought a whole different layer of understanding for me into this story. So, Joey, I wanted to look up what was going on in Argentina at the time that this was written, and I was quite surprised to read this. The article that I pulled up said Argentina's Dirty War and the Transition to Democracy. It was one of the darkest periods in Latin American history from 1976 to 1983. A brutal military junta ruled Argentina in what was called the Dirty War, where some 10,000 persons were disappeared and human rights abuses were rampant. Many of the disappeared were believed to have been abducted by agents of the Argentinian government during these years, and their bodies were often disposed of in rural areas or unmarked graves. So, why am I bringing this up? Obviously, we as Americans don't really have a lot of room to talk about things that have happened. We don't have a stellar past.
Or present.
Past, present, or possibly future. So it's not to call out this in a negative way. It's more of the contextual clues that he gives us. The government in this particular story were blowing up levees, reservoirs, and flooding people out. These explosions. And I was like, well, what is this violence? Is this through the government? Is this rebels? I don't completely understand it. There are hints, but nothing is explicitly said of who is doing what, although he does say his brother was going to try to join him, but he's like, I don't have permission. We're in military lockdown. I just can't get to you. I was like, say what? We don't have that here. We haven't experienced that, at least in my lifetime here in the United States, to be, well, the government has restricted my travel. I can't literally cross this bridge because they said, we're not letting people through today. Sorry. Go around. There is no around. It's an island. I can't go around. So I thought it was very interesting to have that context. But Joey, I don't know about you, but when I read this story, I'm like, this is Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. I am getting that creepy going through the water, the storytelling, Mr. Kurtz, all of those elements echoing through this story. And I don't think that was intentional. Maybe my brain just automatically goes to the apocalypse now feeling I get based on Heart of Darkness, and I couldn't shake it. The reason I bring that up is when I was looking at this gentleman's history. He was born in 1937 to a Syrian family who had relocated to Argentina. He went to school and then he moved to Paris to teach. But when he was going through school, he studied law and philosophy. And when he went to teach in France, he taught cinematography and the history of film. And I'm like, yeah, this whole story feels like a movie scene. And it was not a coincidence to me when I was like, oh, this does feel like Apocalypse Now with the craziness and falling out of the boat. And what's up with Washington, this crazy speech and having the guy dictate. It was a lot, Joey. So I'll leave it at that, but it really echoed through me. I couldn't not see that once I was getting that vibe.
Yeah, there is so much in this story. There are so many details. Even though, like you said in the very beginning, plot-wise, not much going on. But there is so much introspection, obviously, because it's a stream of consciousness story. There are so many little details that we could go over, and I'm sure we could spend many, many hours talking about. But I wanted to go back to the flooding, because there is a section where it's not explained well enough. There's like an excuse as to why it happened. So he says, as I am passing again through the living room, intercepting the television screen with my body, my mother tells me, according to the bulletin in the afternoon, that the military has exploded dynamite along the coast road to allow the water to flow out and reduce the pressure that has been building for days against the suspension bridge, threatening to sweep it away. So there's at least some type of excuse that the military, or in this case the government, obviously would be in control of that, are giving its citizens to say, we're doing this because we have to. Don't worry about it. It's fine. Sorry we flooded you out, but it's a necessary thing. The suspension bridge was under too much pressure. Okay, now I don't build bridges, so I don't know. That seems suspect to me.
It is for your own good. We have to blow this up for the greater good. And Joey, that took me back to the images of New Orleans when Katrina happened and the levee
Mhm.
broke. It was an accident. We have seen in the last 20 years various natural disasters in the United States where cities are washed away, people are in boats, communities are endangered. And I think what struck me about what you just said is that the military planned it. They said, this is something we need to do. Then, because I'm in this cinema frame of reference, apparently, I thought of the movie Deliverance. They're also blowing up certain geographical things to let water recede, flooding certain areas so other areas would be more habitable. And I just thought that was such an interesting concept
Mhm.
because knowing about the political upheaval and the unrest and the discontent that was happening in Argentina at that time, was the flood a metaphor for the discontent the entire community was feeling? And they're like, we are under a lot of pressure and something needs to happen. And the government's like, oh, don't worry, we'll handle it. It's like, well, you're going to handle it by harming a whole community and displacing tons of people. And what happens if you don't get out in time? Are you just killed?
Mhm.
Who's responsible for the evacuation? It brought up a lot of things contemporarily in the United States. Who's responsible for the well being of the citizens in this story? And the government's like, well, kind of not our problem. We told you to go. It'll be fine. This idea of who gets to decide what is best for a community. And when the explosions take place, we are told by several different people where they were when they happened. But I also have a huge question mark in my mind because the story had been repeated so many times from so many people's different perspectives of the same event. What actually happened? Because near the end, when he said he was boarding the bus to go to the airport so he could depart, he heard an explosion. And in that moment, I
Mhm.
thought he was killed because he said, I'm all the colors, I'm above the scene. But then he continues. There's so much playfulness of time and perspective in the story. If I read it a third time, I probably would have an even better understanding of what was happening because I think he's purposely using this language to disorient us in some way, to know that nobody can ever actually know what the facts are.
Yeah, I'm not sure how the timeline works because this is something that just happened in the beginning. The explosions happened, there was two of them, the levees were breached because of that, and the city was flooded. But then he's talking about as he's navigating and trying to get to Paris, that there are military encampments that have already been set up and people are already living in them. And it feels like a pretty immediate reaction to something that literally just happened the night before. How did they get all of that to happen so quickly? And they seem to be policed by the military here. I wasn't 100% sure. I don't think that this is happening at the pace that he is telling us or that we're hearing it because obviously this is stream of consciousness. So we're getting his inner monologues most of the time. I think there is an issue with the times because I'm not sure that this could physically happen that quickly.
Joey, I love that you said that because one of the things that we talked about last week when we introduced the idea of stream of consciousness is this internal monologue. It is this fluidity of space and time. It's not a direct, straightforward A, B, C, D, E narrative. It is like our own thoughts, very disjointed at times. There was one example in the story that we read that reminded me of what a bad stream of consciousness experience would be like, which was interesting that he put it in there. So you may be thinking about the same scene that I'm thinking when he goes to see Washington on this high ground, literally, talk about taking the high road. Yes, he was taking the high ground. It felt like they were doing some type of reporting or some type of literary thing with a typewriter. And this
Mhm.
guy, Washington, starts giving him the dictation to transcribe. And the author puts in that fragment. And that was unreadable to me, Joey. This is total nonsense because he repeats things. He has this political stance. His sentences don't make any sense. Sometimes we talk about, oh, a bad writer will just randomly talk about things that seem to be disjointed and never make any sense. That particular little section hinted towards that. But I think the mastery of this writer is that even though he was showing you, this guy reminded me of Kurt. He just felt like he was out of his mind. He was like, the workers have to work, but the workers have rights. And then he would really say those words words again. Dude, you're not making any sense. I think A, you need some punctuation. I think you also need to put the coffee cup down. I think you just need to like slow your roll and get your thoughts together before you try to dictate to this person. But the author did such a great job of scrambling our brain by going, wait, when you're in real time hearing somebody who's just stream of consciousness, just spewing out random things that don't have any structure, you're like, no, thank you. I'll just type this down. And the percussive nature of hearing, he made a very strong point of you can hear the clicking of the typewriter keys. Joanne, I think you probably had the same experience. This was a very visceral story. He told us what to smell, what to feel, what to taste, what sensations, the grounding of gravel as they drove on a road and the shining chrome of this black car as seen from above, which that's a drone shot before they had drone shots, right? You could see all these things. So cinematic. I just was very impressed, and I think this comes up in many of our stories, when an author can bring us so clearly into the story. There was a lot of smoking. Side note, spoiler alert.
That's a spoiler.
He did die of lung cancer at the age of 67.
Oh, the actual author. Yeah,
Or did die in Paris of the lung cancer in 2005. And there's a lot of smoking, but there is the visceral, they hear lighting the match and handing it off to the other person, and the smell of smoke and the ash falling off of the spent butt of the cigarette and all of these things. As a person who grew up as a child with a community of people who smoked cigarettes, that felt very real and evoked that time in my life. Yeah, that's so gross. But I knew exactly what that tasted and smelled and felt like to be witnessing that. He talks a lot about like the smoke rolling in or just kind of clouding their field of vision.
I was actually reminded more of Virginia Woolf as I was reading, because there's a lot of descriptions of nature and there's a lot of colors that are incorporated into his writing. And that feels like a very Virginia Woolf thing to do. Metaphorically painting a canvas for us to imagine throughout the entire story. And yeah, there is sort of a smoke screen throughout the story because it is brought up so much. And there is a lot of repetition in this story as well, which is something that you often would see in stream of consciousness narratives because we think about the same stuff all the time. Something's bothering us, or if there's something that's just stuck in our head for one reason or another. This story is a little bit more complicated than our previous story, The Encounter by Goli Taragi, where that one was a pretty straightforward stream of consciousness narrative, and this one requires a little bit more effort. Maybe it was just me, I don't know, but it felt like the narrative got more complex as I was going on. In the beginning, it felt a little bit, not simplistic, but a little easier to understand. And not that it ever got too hard to understand, except for that one section. I was like, yeah, this feels pretty modernist to me. The narrative got more complex. It felt like, in my opinion, that it was supposed to be sort of reflective of the narrator Pigeon mental state or mental noise, because he's getting closer to his self-exile in Paris, because of course he's trying to escape this government turmoil and upset that's happening in Argentina at this point. So to me, it felt like that made sense for his inner monologue to sort of get a little harder to follow, which I really appreciated, because that's something that, Sally Rooney wasn't stream of consciousness, but in Intermezzo, she has two main characters. Ivan and Peter have very different narrative styles. Peter is addicted to different substances, so his narrative is sort of all over the place and a little fragmented, a little staccato. I really appreciate when an author can do that and invoke that perspective in the reader. And I think Edgar Allan Poe does this really well too, where the physical way that he's writing on the page really lends itself for us to understand the narrator or the main character protagonist's mental state.
And Joey, this harkens back to the story we discussed last week. We were talking about repetition and echoes within this story, but this also echoes the story that we read last week about self-exile in Paris, about going to a party, and because of the government's intervention, bad things are going to happen to people and there will be a punishment.
What are the odds?
There will be some social interventions. We learn about the social customs, who has freedom, who doesn't, what are the judgments about sexuality and morality and who you can be with and why you can be with them. I thought that was just a very interesting coincidence / not coincidence. And Joey, I would love to just read the first paragraph of the story because I think it encapsulates so beautifully, setting us up for the adventure we're about to go on. It's also a great illustration of the way in which he uses punctuation to literally set several different scenes in this opening paragraph. So I'm just going to read. A harsh diagonal column of light comes in through the window and settles on the wood floor in a yellow circle, inside of which a million pale particles wheel around, while the smoke of my cigarette, rising from the bed, enters it and slowly disperses on this May morning, from which I can see, through the window, the blue sky. Insomnia. Okay, that's all one sentence. There's a lot going on there.
Yeah. It's a run
And
on.
I got to read the next sentence here. I'll get up in a while, take the clothes off my brother's empty bed, get dressed, go out into the street for my first cup of coffee at the Galleria, smoking my third or fourth cigarette of the day, standing next to the counter, looking down the way, not speaking, not tasting either the coffee or the smoke, a man about 30 years old, to those who see me from the outside, sometimes mistaken for my brother. Someone will surely come along to greet me, thinking I am him and not me, the one I know myself to be, and through the window of the Galleria, I will see the sunlight falling onto the red metal tables in the practically empty patio. The workday. Okay, I'm not going to read any more of that, Joey, but literally that was 2 sentences, and that was
Yeah.
3 minutes of reading. I appreciate that because this does feel like this stream of consciousness. He is just really letting us live in his mind. We are seeing where he's at. We are understanding things that are important to him. He's giving all of these clues. My brother's bed that is not slept in. I'm smoking cigarettes. I'm drinking coffee. I'm going to a place I don't even know myself versus my brother because people mistake both of us. Am I clear on who I am? He did such a great job of grounding us in that moment for a lot of the ideas that we're going to end up tackling at the conclusion of the story. I just wanted to go back to what you said about the colors. So for me, the color green came up an excessive number of times.
That and white.
And steel blue, right? I had asked my Argentinian friend if there was any significance in the color green. And I just want to read what he said about this because I thought that was very, very interesting. Because it's not specific to Argentina. He wrote, the only idea that came to mind is the Argentinian term verde esperanza. In other words, green as the color of hope. But I cannot see that green has a unique significance in Argentinian writing in general. Again, in dealing with translation versus being in the native language, some of these translations will not come through. But when I thought of the color green as hope, I was like, maybe. He talks about the woman's dress, who he is really hot and bothered for. She was in a green wool dress, and he's getting on the bus that's going to take him to the airport, that's going to let him flee his location for his exile in Paris. There's just all of these very interesting, like, maybe that does symbolize hope or freedom. Then the military side of my brain kicked in and I was like, you know what's green? Military trucks, fatigues, guys who are standing there with machine guns about to blow your head off. That's the other connotation for me of what might be happening with green. So it was kind of interesting to have those two very different interpretations.
Yeah. And I think in the first 2 sentences that you read, you can get a sense of how cinematic this is. I didn't know that he studied cinematography, so it didn't even click to me. But after you said that, I was like, yeah, this is a very cinematic sort of story. It's just very easy to get lost in this writing. I feel like that happens kind of with stream of consciousness, depending on who you're reading, but especially this story where it's very easy to just sort of get lost in what's going on and following Pigeon. And sort of being like, oh no, I can see everything that's happening. It's very vivid. It's unless you have that thing where you can't imagine things in your head. What is that name? I can't remember. Anyway, my brother-in-law has it. So if you can't imagine things, but if you can, then it's very easy to get lost in this narrative. Again, I'm just so impressed by this translation because I think the writing came through so beautifully. I'm sure it's even more beautiful in Spanish, but there are so many lines that I just had to highlight because I was like, I don't know what these mean really, but they're just so beautifully done.
Joey, similar to you, I highlighted so much in this
Mhm.
section of the collection. Obviously, we don't have time to read all of those, but I was chuckling because you said your brother in law has this trait where it is difficult for him to imagine things in his head. And I think I have the opposite of that. I have a hyper imagination.
That is a thing,
I
yeah.
can imagine things so clearly. That is why I was so affected by this story. I felt his disconnection from his mother, who he said she listens, but you know deep down she's very indifferent to what is happening to us, her children, and to her world. And I thought, well, that's not awesome. And he talks about his friend Hector, who's the painter who paints in a white room and he paints a white picture where he's like, dude, I'm not quite sure what's happening here. His friend does everything in verticals. The narrator, who we find out 3/4 of the way through the story or longer, is called Pigeon. It was not quickly that we heard that nickname for him. He talks a lot about diagonals, about this intersection, about dark and light and half being erased. And he's like, I don't know where I end and where my brother doesn't. One day he went to see a man named Washington. Why is his name Washington? That seems like a US name. That doesn't seem like something you would hear in Argentina. My friends are not given American names in Argentina. It was interesting for me that they talk about this empty bed, right? There's a sense of loss. There's a sense of longing. Where's his brother? We don't know what should be happening. We meet his brother's wife and or his lover. And it's like, is that his wife or is that his lover? And when she mentions, oh, you never know what my husband's going to do, I'm like, wait, we were just talking about your lover. I'm so confused. Who's with who? And so I had to make my little chart of who all of these people were and what their relationships were. And I think that was also part of the point of the author. It doesn't matter. Some of these people are interchangeable. Some of these people are mixing and matching with their experience. And the only thing that rang really true for me is when there was a rivalry between two women who may or may not be interested in the same man. She walked in, the other girl looked in, and he said something to the effect of, the woman's negativity and anger just rolled out like a blanket and got on everybody. And I thought, oh, I have been that woman and I have been the recipient of someone's wave of disdain. That you're like, okay, I think the party's wrapping up, guys. We gotta go. Hector was one of the first people who were named. So that is the best friend of Pigeon and possibly Cat, because again, their social circles sometimes match and sometimes don't. He's a painter who was talking about William Faulkner. And his friend's like, no, stick to your painters. Why are you bringing up Faulkner? It felt interesting that that was mentioned in this story. I found that highly peculiar. And then they talked about different types of philosophy. So this felt like Voorhees to me in a lot of ways. Time was bending. I didn't completely get all of the references. You could spend time looking up the painters that they talked about and the philosophies that they were explaining. But again, to Voorhees' point, he's helping to elucidate a way of experiencing verse. He's like, just feel what you feel. You don't have to know
Mhm.
what it means. It means whatever it means to you in the moment that you're feeling something. So I got all the feels with this particular story. And I would recommend it for someone who wants to have yet another example of stream of consciousness writing that's a bit more nuanced and difficult than the story we read last week, but also know that it might be a bummer. It made me feel really bummed out.
I didn't feel bummed out about this story. I mean, it wasn't like the best setting. Obviously, there is some bad stuff happening with the government, and he has to flee to Paris for his physical safety or for his financial future, whatever it could be. We don't really get too much of a reason as to why he is doing this. It doesn't matter. His motivation behind it doesn't matter. I think that if you read along with us here, that you'll improve your skills at stream of consciousness. You'll get a slow exposure to different levels of difficulty with this narrative style because it is very challenging. Even in this story that's not super challenging, maybe take that with a grain of salt. Because we've both read a lot of modernist literature. We have read Faulkner together. So sometimes we're not the best people to say it's
Right.
difficult or not.
I'm happy to say, Joey, it is very subjective, especially on this channel. There is no judgment about the way in which people are experiencing reading. So if you're like, I don't get it, or I don't like it, that's awesome. If you don't like it, that is completely okay. I love stream of consciousness, as you know, generally speaking, that is a true statement, because I have an active imagination. I'm always writing dialogue or wondering why people are tangentially referring to things. Just a little side note, in my life with another group, I am reading Proust, Swan's Way, which this author referred to. He spent a lot of time reading Proust. He spent a lot of time reading, and some of these influences flow back in with this luscious language and these half-page sentences that you're like, wait, what are you talking about again? And the only point of fact, Joy, that I was like, I still don't get it, and I think we're not supposed to get it because I don't think we can actually get it. Why did he change his bus ticket? At least two people, maybe his mom was the third person, said they were going to meet him at 10 minutes to midnight to take a bus. And he was like, yeah, I'm just going to get a bus ticket at 10 p.m. I'm just going to change my ticket. And I was like, why? And at first I thought it was so Eliza, who was his last lover in the story, that she was like, oh, I'll be there. And he's like, maybe not. And then she said, oh, I can't make it. And I thought, well, maybe he's not going to wait around if she's not going to show up. It was just a weird loose end that I didn't understand, because once he gets on the bus, we hear explosions. And there's just this weird, to me, out of body experience. He talks about being above the scene. He can see various rainbow colors. And I thought, that feels like heaven to me. That feels like something literally has been shaken loose from this person. But then the story goes on as if nothing really happened, and we're just kind of left on a cliffhanger of, so now what? It goes back to where we started, Joey. What is a city? Is it a construct? Is it a housing for all of these various memories of all of these people? Or, as he stated in the narrative, even when he's gone, the city will carry on without him. So this feeling of displacement, abandonment. He uses the word abandon. He talks about seeing that aerial scene from the car door is it's black and shiny, and the four doors are open, and the men are standing to the side. And again, it felt like freedom, fleeing, escape, catastrophe. Is it an adventure? Is it risking your life? All of these evocative images that I think, depending on the framework that you were entering into the story with, you might have a very different experience.
Yeah. Well said. I don't know. I can't say anything else.
I will leave it at this. I felt this was a self-revelation about writing, because he talks about the guy who had him dictate, and he's typing away this nonsensical treatise this guy is making. Pigeon comes back to his shared room where he and his brother grew up and still coexist, but never at the same time that we've seen in the story. They just keep literally passing each other. Oh, I thought you were going here. Oh, I went here, but then you went somewhere else. He says he opens the third drawer and gets out reams of paper and spends hours ripping them up without reading the pages. He says, without looking at the pages, I just rip them up. And I thought, is that a frustrated writer? Were they blank sheets of paper saying, like, there really is no future for me here? I don't want to leave these behind. It was just a huge question mark for me. He says the phrase, art imitates life, 4 or 5 times in the story, from different people hearing that phrase and saying, remember the time that Hector said, that Pigeon said, art imitates life, different people recalling things they have heard. So it's like this fluid memory that they all share, but none of them were actually there. It felt like storytelling. I love it when a writer is like, let me just tell you, writing's no cakewalk, people. You think that's easy to just jot some things down. I was thinking about his craft, the repetition, the imagery, the stream of consciousness showing us how easy it is, and then also seeing how disjointed and just wacky and ineffective from my standpoint from Washington. This is a master class in how to do this.
Yeah, it is very well done. So I highly recommend everyone read it. First read The Encounter by Gully Targi, and then read this one, and then follow along.
And speaking of things that are increasing in difficulty, Joey, next week we will be reading episode 4, also called chapter 4, Calypso, in James Joyce's Ulysses. We have both experienced this text before. I am looking forward to revisiting it with a perhaps different perspective than I had months ago when we first encountered this. I'm really looking forward to continuing our Stream of Consciousness September. So I will see you then.
See ya.